Hello. Before we start, I need to ask you something. Have you ever driven to the high desert at night, when the road feels longer than it should and the dark presses in so close it feels alive? Out here near Shiprock, the land comes first. Endless red earth, volcanic stone, wind that never fully stops speaking. In the daylight, it's beautiful, quiet, vast, honest. But when the sun drops, that same quiet stretches thin. The space between headlights grows heavy. Shapes don't move until they do. And the farther you are from town, the more the land reminds you how small you really are. If you've ever been near a place like this, you already understand something most people don't. And if you haven't, listen closely. My name is Daniel Yazzie. I've served as a Navajo Tribal Police Officer, assigned to the Shiprock District for just over 14 years. Most nights, it's one unit covering dozens of square miles. Backup can be an hour away, if it comes at all. Radios fail, roads disappear, and sometimes so do people. I thought I understood this job. I was wrong, because there are things I've learned out here that don't exist in any manual. Things no academy prepares you for. Things that never make it into an official report, but still decide who comes home after dark. I've gone back and forth about telling this story, because once it's said out loud, it doesn't belong to me anymore. And some things, especially the rules, were never meant to travel far from this land. I worked nights in Shiprock. That alone should tell you enough. We're trained for isolation, for long response times, for making decisions without witnesses. But there's a difference between being alone and being exposed. There are rules we follow out here that aren't written anywhere, not because they're unofficial, but because acknowledging them would mean admitting what we've already lost learning them. I'm sharing this now because someone listening might recognize the signs before it's too late. And because pretending this is just another job stopped working a long time ago. I'm a police officer. I swore an oath to protect people. And some nights, the hardest part is knowing when not to respond. When you work nights in Shiprock long enough, you stop thinking of the land as a backdrop. It becomes a presence, constant, patient, and older than anything you were trained for. The monolith itself rises out of the desert like a broken tooth, black against the stars, visible from miles away. By day, tourists pull over, photograph it. By night, it becomes a silhouette you measure your distance by, the last fixed point before the dark starts to rearrange itself. My patrol usually began the same way. I'd check my unit, log mileage, test the radio. Dispatch would read off weather and outstanding bolos in that flat, practiced tone. Out here, we don't rush the start of a shift. You don't challenge the land by acting impatient. Elders taught us that long before any academy did. Respect isn't superstition, it's survival. That's why the rules exist. Rule number 1 is the first one you learn, though no one ever sits you down and labels it that way. Never follow a call that comes from a location that doesn't exist on your map. Not GPS. Your map. People from outside don't understand why we still carry printed maps folded and refold until the creases soften. They trust satellites, blue dots, turn-by-turn voices that sound confident even when they're wrong. But GPS doesn't know washed-out arroyos or seasonal roads that vanish after one storm. It doesn't know which paths were never roads to begin with, just tire marks that led somewhere once and shouldn't be followed again. My map is marked by hand. Pencil notes from officers who came before me. Crossed-out spurs. Circles with no explanation. There are places that don't have names, only warnings. About 2 hours into that shift, the radio cracked a lie with a welfare check. Dispatch logged it cleanly. Call a concern about an elderly male, last seen earlier that day, possibly confused, possibly alone. That part wasn't unusual. What caught my attention was the location. Unit 12, dispatch said, "Can you respond to a welfare check near Red Mesa Road, off County Spur 7? I didn't answer right away. Red Mesa Road exists. County Spur 7 does not. I flipped my map open on the steering wheel. Dome light low. County spurs are numbered. I knew them by muscle memory. 1 through 6. 8 skipped straight to the north. 7 had been retired before I started. Closed after flash flooding, cut it clean in half. Officially, it was decommissioned. Unofficially, Locals avoided the area long before that. Confirm location, I said, keeping my voice even. Dispatch repeated it, word for word. Exactly the same. That's another thing you learn to listen for. Not what's said, but how. No hesitation. No confusion. As if the system itself believed what it was reading. I asked for cross streets. Dispatch hesitated this time. Papers shuffled. Keyboard clicks. There aren't any listed, she said. Caller says it's about 2 miles past the old cattle gate. There's no cattle gate on Spur 7. I felt that familiar tightening behind my ribs. Not fear, not yet. More like recognition. The land clearing its throat. I logged the call as pending and pulled off onto the shoulder, hazard lights ticking. Procedure allows for clarification delays when location can't be verified. Out here, that pause can mean the difference between coming back at dawn or not coming back at all. The map confirmed what I already knew. That road ended in blank space. Not private land, not restricted, just nothing. The kind of nothing that doesn't show up in databases because no one wants to admit it's there. This is where GPS fails people. If I'd followed the coordinates dispatch eventually sent, my unit would have driven confidently into terrain that doesn't behave like terrain should. Distance stretches, turns repeat, radio signal drops in neat, predictable increments that don't line up with topography. We've tested it. Not officially, but enough. I radioed back that I was attempting to locate the spur and requested a callback number for the reporting party. Dispatch said there wasn't one. That's when rule number 1 stops being a guideline and starts being a wall. I sat there longer than protocol recommends, engine idling, listening to the wind move across the hood. Out here, silence isn't empty. It carries. If you've ever been somewhere remote enough that your thoughts feel louder than your radio, you know what I mean. You start noticing details you usually ignore, how the stars seem sharper, how shadows don't quite line up with their sources. I thought about the caller, about the man who might actually be alone somewhere, waiting. That's the hook. It always is. Compassion is a powerful thing to weaponize. I updated dispatch that I could not verify the road on my map and requested another unit to confirm. They reminded me I was the only unit available for at least 45 minutes. That's the part people don't like to talk about. Understaffing isn't just an inconvenience, it's leverage. It forces choices. It pressures you to bend rules you didn't even know you were following. I almost did. Instead, I asked dispatch to recheck the log time. The call had come in 8 minutes earlier than it should have, based on the system timestamp. A small thing, easy to miss. But if you work nights long enough, you learn to trust patterns. And when something breaks pattern without explanation, you don't rush toward it. Finally, dispatch cleared the call, marked it unable to locate. No supervisor pushback, no follow-up. Just gone, like it had never existed. I stayed parked another 5 minutes anyway, watching the dark beyond my headlights. Nothing moved. Nothing needed to. If you've ever been somewhere isolated and felt that instinct to double-check a detail, to reread a sign, to confirm a turn, pay attention to that. It's not paranoia. It's experience trying to keep you alive. When I finally pulled back on the road, the radio was quiet. Too quiet. And as I drove north, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been listening long before it decided to speak. That was the first rule reminding me it was still in effect. And it wouldn't be the last. After the call was cleared, the night didn't reset the way it usually does. There's a rhythm to patrol work out here. Long stretches of nothing, broken by moments that demand everything at once. When a call drops, you feel the land exhale. This time it didn't. The dark stayed tight around the unit, like it was waiting to see what I'd do next. Shiprock District covers more ground than most people realize. On paper, it's just lines on a jurisdiction map. In reality, it's canyons, washes, dead-end roads, and miles of nothing between scattered lights. Some nights, you're the only officer responsible for all of it. One set of eyes, one radio, one vehicle that can only be in one place at a time. Backup is a concept, not a guarantee. We say delayed response in reports. It sounds reasonable, manageable, What it really means is that if something goes wrong, you solve it yourself or you don't solve it at all. That kind of pressure changes how you think. It forces you to rely on instincts that aren't taught and rules that aren't written. That's how you survive long enough to realize not everyone does. His name was Aaron Begay, younger than me by almost a decade. Fresh out of the academy, when he was assigned to ride with me on nights. He was sharp, motivated, the kind of officer who still believed doing everything by the book would keep him safe. I didn't correct that belief right away. You don't want to break someone too early. Aaron asked a lot of questions about routes, about landmarks that didn't show up on GPS, about why I carried a paper map when the MDT screen glowed right there in front of us. I gave him partial answers. Enough to do the job, not enough to scare him. That was my mistake. The night it happened, we were already stretched thin. Another unit had called in sick. A supervisor was tied up hours away. Dispatch warned us response times would be extended. Aaron nodded like it was just another logistical issue. We got a radio call near the edge of our coverage area. Possible trespass. Unconfirmed. The location was real. On the map, clearly marked. But it sat close to an area most officers avoided unless they had to. I hesitated. Aaron didn't. We should clear it, he said, before it escalates. That sense of urgency, the need to prove yourself, can be dangerous out here. I told him to wait, to let dispatch gather more information. He keyed the mic before I could stop him, and then the radio crackled again. Daniel, just my name, no unit number, no call sign. I froze. Dispatch logs every transmission. There's a tone, a cadence. This wasn't that. The voice sounded like it came through the radio, but not from it, like someone had learned how to imitate the sound without understanding the rhythm. Aaron looked at me, confused. You gonna answer? That's when I told him rule number 2. If you hear your name over the radio when no one is logged in, do not answer. I didn't explain why. I just told him not to respond. Ever. Not out loud. Not on the mic. Not even to acknowledge it to yourself. He laughed it off, said it was probably bleed over or interference. Rookie explanations for things that don't want to be explained. The voice came again. Closer this time. Same name. Same inflection. But the timing was off too quick, like it was impatient. Aaron reached for the radio. I grabbed his wrist. Harder than I meant to. Don't, I said. And for the first time, he heard something in my voice that shut him up. We cleared that call without incident. Or so the report says. 2 weeks later, Aaron was riding solo. I'd been reassigned temporarily to cover another sector. He radioed in a traffic stop just after midnight. Routine. Logged. Normal. I remember thinking how confident he sounded. Then came the pause. Dead air stretches differently when you're listening for it. Dispatch tried to raise him. No response. Another unit was over an hour away. I broke protocol and started driving anyway. Lights off, pushing the speed I shouldn't have. The location was marked, but the closer I got, the less sense it made. Landmarks didn't line up. Turns felt repeated. I heard it on the radio before I saw the unit. Daniel. Same voice. I didn't answer. When I reached the scene, Aaron's cruiser was there. Engine cold. Driver's door open. Radio still on. The mic lay on the ground like it had been dropped mid-thought. There were no signs of a struggle. No footprints leading away. Just tire tracks that ended too cleanly, like the road had decided it didn't want to be a road anymore. The official conclusion was voluntary disappearance. Stress. Personal issues. That's what happens when there's nothing to file against. But I knew better. I'd warned him. Not clearly enough. Not soon enough. Guilt doesn't hit all at once. It settles in layers. Every night after, I replayed that moment. My hand on his wrist, the look on his face. The rules are only useful if you pass them on. And even then, they don't always listen. That's when the mimicry started happening more often. Dispatch voices repeating phrases slightly wrong. Called times logged a minute before they were spoken. Unit numbers transposed. Small things. Easy to dismiss if you wanted to. I didn't. I started double-checking everything. logs, maps, silence, especially silence. Because silence, out here, can mean you're being given space. Or it can mean something's waiting for you to fill it. Some nights, I'd hear my name and feel that instinctive pull to respond, to assert control, to prove I was still there. Every time, I remembered Aaron. And every time, I stayed quiet. Responsibility weighs heavier when you're the one left holding it. I stayed on nights, took extra shifts, watched the edges of my patrol, like something might step through if I looked away too long. The land didn't give anything back. It just kept listening. And somewhere between the static and the dark, I realized the rules weren't just about survival anymore. They were about containment, about not letting something learn too much about you. Because once it knows your name, it doesn't need the radio anymore. Once something learns your name, you start noticing how often the world tries to say it back to you. After Aaron disappeared, I became meticulous in ways that annoyed supervisors and probably saved my life. I logged everything, every pause on the radio, every discrepancy in timestamps. I stopped trusting silence as neutral. Silence meant something was deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. That night started quietly enough. Too quietly. No late traffic stops. No domestic calls carrying across the radio. No drunk drivers drifting over the center line. The land felt attentive. Not hostile. Just alert. Like a person pretending not to watch you while never blinking. At 1:17, dispatch toned out a call that made my stomach tighten before the details even came through. Unit 12, respond to a disturbance call. Possible shouting reported near Tebedai Wash. Mile marker 32. Everything about that sentence was wrong. First, Tebedai Wash doesn't have mile markers. The road that runs near dead ends before 30. Second, disturbance calls require a secondary confirmation out here. Another caller, a patrol observation, something. Third, and most important, the wash is listed as restricted night access after a fatal incident years back. No one should have been routed there without supervisor approval. And yet, the call was logged. Clean, time-stamped, proper code. It existed in the system as if it belonged. I asked dispatch to repeat the details. They did exactly the same, without adding or removing a word. That alone raised the hair on my arms. Humans paraphrase. Systems don't. I checked the MDT. The call was already marked as en route. Even though I hadn't keyed up, someone or something had jumped ahead of me. That's when rule number 3 came back to the front of my mind. Never arrive early. It sounds counterintuitive, especially in law enforcement, where response time is everything. But out here, early arrivals create gaps. Gaps between expectation and reality. And whatever lives in those gaps doesn't like being surprised. I told dispatch I was delayed due to terrain. That bought me time. Not much, but enough to pull over and study the map again. The wash area was there, but the access road listed on the call wasn't. It was another blank space pretending to be specific. I waited until the call time caught up to the system clock. Only then did I start moving. As I drove, the headlights cut through scrub and rock that felt subtly unfamiliar. Same shapes, same colors, but arranged wrong. The land wasn't empty anymore. It felt aware of my path, like it was tracing my progress rather than revealing itself. About halfway there, the radio crackled. Unit 12, update your status. Dispatch voice. Normal cadence. Normal tone. I responded with my location and ETA. Careful not to give exact distances. Precision can be an invitation. There was a pause, longer than necessary. Copy, dispatch said. Be advised, call report subject, may be approaching your position. That violated protocol number 4 on the checklist. You don't update callers with officer movements, and callers don't track officers unless they can see them. I was alone on that road. No structures. No vehicles. No one should have known where I was. I slowed the unit to a crawl. The shouting started before I reached the wash. Distant, human-shaped sounds, but stretched thin, like someone yelling underwater. I stopped well short of the coordinates dispatch provided. Early arrival would have put me closer. I stayed back, engine idling, lights off. That's when I noticed the ground. Footprints, barely visible, leading away from the wash, not toward it, like something had already left. The radio clicked again. Daniel. Not dispatch, not the system. Just my name, spoken softly this time. Almost curious. I didn't answer. I logged my arrival time manually, padding it by 3 minutes. Then I keyed up and requested confirmation of the caller's identity. Dispatch hesitated. I could hear breathing on the line. Actual breathing. That shouldn't transmit. There's no callback information, she said. The call originated internally. Internally where? Before I could ask, the shouting stopped. Not faded. Stopped, like someone had closed the door. Every instinct told me to turn around. To clear the call is unfounded and leave the area untouched. But duty doesn't shut off just because fear turns on. If there was someone out there confused, injured, real, I'd be abandoning them. That's the moral trap. The land doesn't force you. It offers you a choice and lets you live with it. I exited the vehicle and stood still, listening. Wind moved through the wash, carrying the smell of damp stone. No voices, no movement, but the quiet felt crowded, like I'd stepped into a room full of people holding their breath. I advanced on foot, counting my steps, careful not to cross the invisible line where the road stopped pretending to exist. The farther I went, the more wrong my sense of distance felt. 20 steps felt like 50. The wash seemed both closer and farther away with every breath. The radio chirped once. Unit 12, are you on scene? Dispatch again. But the timestamp on my MDT read 1:16. 1 minute before the call had even been logged. I backed away slowly, eyes never leaving the dark ahead of me. The footprints were gone. The wash looked untouched, smooth as if nothing had disturbed it in days. I cleared the call as unable to locate, my voice steady even as my pulse wasn't. Dispatch acknowledged without comment. No supervisor follow-up. No incident review. The call disappeared from the active log within minutes. But it stayed in the archive. I checked later. It's still there. That night, as I drove away, I had the unmistakable feeling of being watched, not hunted, not threatened. Studied, like something had learned how close it could get before I noticed. I didn't arrive early. I didn't stay late. And I didn't answer when my name was spoken. But I knew, then, that the rules weren't just about avoiding danger anymore. They were about learning how to move through a place that was learning how to call you back. And next time, it wouldn't need dispatch at all. After that night, I stopped pretending the calls were the problem. Calls are just the excuse. The land is the constant. People who didn't grow up here talk about fear like it's the same thing as respect. It isn't. Fear makes you react. Respect makes you pause. Our elders never warned us about monsters or spirits in the way outsiders expect. They spoke in absences, in cautions, in what not to do. You learn early that naming things give them shape, and shape give them permission. That's why the warnings were always indirect. Don't whistle at night. Don't follow voices you didn't see arrive. Don't assume silence means safety. And later, after enough nights alone, don't acknowledge movement you can't hear. That one became rule number 4. It sounds simple until you're the only person standing under a sky full of stars, watching something shift at the edge of your headlights with no accompanying sound. No footstep. No brush against rock. Just motion, divorced from cause. The first time it happened, I told myself I was tired. I was 3 nights into a stretch of doubles, running on caffeine and habit. Fatigue does things to perception. It fills in gaps, makes shadows breathe. I knew that. I'd taught that. So when I saw something move just beyond the beam of my flashlight during a perimeter check near a remote Hogan, I didn't turn my head right away. I listened. Nothing. No wind. No animal movement. No echo of displaced gravel. The instinct to look directly at it was strong. Almost reflexive. That's the part people don't talk about. The pull. The urge to confirm what you already know you shouldn't. Instead, I kept my eyes forward and finished the check like nothing was wrong. My heart didn't slow until I was back in the unit, with the doors locked and the engine running. That's when the exhaustion caught up to me. Isolation wears you down quietly. There's no dramatic breaking point, just a gradual erosion of certainty. You start questioning whether the rules are protecting you or isolating you further, whether you're being cautious or cowardly, whether staying alive is worth what it costs you mentally. I started second-guessing myself more after Aaron. Every decision felt heavier. Every delay felt like a potential failure. I wondered how many calls I'd cleared that might have been real. How many people I'd left waiting, because the land had trained me to hesitate. That doubt is dangerous, because the land listens for it. The distortions became harder to ignore after that. Sound started behaving strangely, arriving late or not at all. I'd see a raven take flight before hearing its wings. Rocks would tumble in the wash seconds after I saw them fall. It was like the world had developed a lag, as if reality itself was buffering. Light followed suit. My headlights would illuminate things that vanished when I stepped closer. The moon would reflect off surfaces that shouldn't have reflected at all. Once, during a traffic stop miles from a nearest structure, the red and blue strobes bounced back at me from an angle that suggested something tall and flat standing just beyond the road. There was nothing there when I checked. I stopped mentioning these things in my logs. Not because they weren't happening, but because writing them down felt like inviting scrutiny I couldn't afford. Out here, credibility keeps you employed, and employment keeps you present. Leaving would have meant abandoning the district to officers who didn't know the rules yet, so I carried it alone. Some nights, I'd park on a ridge and kill the engine, letting the dark settle around me. That's when you can feel the land most clearly, not as threat, but as awareness, like standing in deep water, knowing something vast moves beneath the surface without ever breaking it. That's when I started noticing how often procedure conflicted with intuition. Procedure says investigate. Intuition says wait. Procedure says announce your presence. Intuition says silence keeps you whole. I don't tell you this to suggest ignoring your training. Training saves lives. But it doesn't account for places that don't behave like places. And if you've ever been somewhere remote enough that your instincts screamed while your checklist stayed calm, you already understand the choice I had to make. One night, near the edge of my patrol zone, I watched movement trace the ridgeline parallel to my unit. Smooth, upright, keeping pace. I never heard it. Not once. I stared straight ahead and drove on. The movement stopped when I stopped acknowledging it. Not with my eyes, not with my posture, not with my thoughts. That's the hardest part. You can't just not look. You have to refuse to engage internally. Curiosity is a door. By the time my shift ended, my head throbbed with exhaustion. I sat in the locker room longer than usual, hands resting on my knees, wondering how much longer I could do this. How many nights I could carry unspoken rules without letting them turn into something heavier, something like fear. But fear isn't what keeps you alive here. Respect does. Respect for the land, for the warnings passed down quietly, for the part of yourself that knows when to pause, even when no one is watching. As I drove home that morning, the sun rising over Shiprock like nothing was wrong, I realized something else had changed. The land wasn't just reacting anymore. It was responding, and I had the uneasy sense that whatever came next wouldn't be content with watching from a distance. By the time I realized the land was responding, it was already too late to pretend I could keep everything at a distance. I told myself I was managing it, that the rules were enough, that respect and restraint would hold the line. But exhaustion has a way of softening edges, especially the ones you rely on most. Compassion does the rest. It whispers that this time is different, that this time the rules can bend without breaking. That's how it got me. The call came in just after 2 o'clock. Not urgent. Not flagged. A simple welfare check near an old cluster of trailers south of my usual patrol route. The address existed. The road existed. Every box checked clean. After weeks of anomalies, it almost felt like relief. The caller was an elderly woman. Her voice shook, but not in the wrong way. No distortion. No delay. She said her grandson hadn't come home, that he'd gone walking after dark and hadn't answered his phone. She was worried. She sounded tired. Real. I thought of my own grandmother, of how fear settles differently when night stretches on too long. I acknowledged the call and rolled out. The area was quiet when I arrived. Too quiet, But that alone wasn't enough anymore. I followed procedure, announced my presence, knocked on doors, spoke with a woman face to face. She thanked me in Navajo, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. Nothing about her felt wrong. She pointed toward a dirt path leading away from the trailers, barely visible in the dark. "He went that way," she said. "He knows the land." That should have been enough. I stepped onto the path without thinking about the map. It wasn't on it. That realization came a few steps too late, sliding into place like a blade finding a gap. The path was worn but not maintained. No tire tracks. No recent footprints I could trust. Just earth pressed down by repetition, leading into scrub and shadow. I hesitated. Compassion pushed me forward. The farther I walked, the more the world narrowed. Sound dampened. My radio hissed softly, but no traffic cut through. I called out once, just once, and immediately regretted it. My voice didn't echo the way it should have. It felt absorbed. That's when I noticed a light. My flashlight illuminated the ground ahead of me, but not consistently. Rocks flickered in and out of clarity. Shadows slid against the beam instead of away from it. I slowed, every sense straining for something solid to anchor to. Movement passed between two stands of brush to my left. I heard nothing. Rule number 4 screamed in my head. I didn't look. I kept walking, eyes fixed forward, breath shallow. The movement paced me, always just out of view. My instincts begged me to stop, to turn back, to reestablish distance. But then I heard something else. Crying. A child's voice. Soft, uneven, calling for help. It sounded like it came from straight ahead. I broke into a jog. That's when I violated rule number 5. I didn't know it was a rule yet. Not until after. Not until it cost me everything. Rule number 5 is this. Never follow distress that moves away from you. The crying receded as I advanced, maintaining distance with impossible precision, close enough to feel real, far enough to pull me deeper. My radio cut out entirely, replaced by a low, irregular hum that vibrated in my chest more than my ears. Then I saw him. Aaron stood in the middle of the path, illuminated by my flashlight, like he'd been waiting there the whole time. He looked wrong in ways I can't fully explain. Not injured, not distorted, just incomplete, like a memory someone had filled in too quickly. His uniform was clean, too clean. His eyes tracked me a fraction of a second after my movements, like he was catching up. "Daniel," he said, perfectly. My name, exactly as he used to say it. Every rule I knew collapsed under the weight of that moment. I stepped toward him. The land reacted instantly. The air thickened, pressing against my ears. The hum rose in pitch. Aaron smiled, and the crying stopped all at once, cut off like a switch had been thrown. I don't remember deciding to run. I just did. The path twisted behind me, stretching longer than it should have been. My legs burned. My lungs felt shallow, like the air was thinning the farther I went. I didn't look back. I didn't answer when my name followed me, repeating, stacking, overlapping. When I broke out of the scrub, I collapsed against my unit, hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. The radio screamed back to life with overlapping transmissions, none of them addressed to me. I drove without headlights until the road reappeared where it was supposed to be. The official report says the welfare check was resolved. The grandson was located the next morning, miles away, unharmed, with no memory of the night. The grandmother never existed in the system. No record, no address history, no neighbors who remembered her. Aaron's case remains open. I carry the guilt of that night like an extra piece of gear, always there, always heavy. I broke a rule I didn't know because I wanted to help, because compassion felt safer than hesitation in that moment. I was wrong. The land didn't punish me. It taught me, and lessons learned that way don't fade. After that night, the rules stopped feeling like precautions. They felt like boundaries. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that whatever I'd encountered wasn't finished with me yet. It had learned what compassion could make me do. And next time, it wouldn't need to wear a familiar face. After that night, the land stopped pretending. It didn't rush me. It didn't escalate all at once. It waited, the way it always does, until routine tried to settle back in, until I convinced myself that what I'd seen on that path, what I'd almost followed, had been a singular lapse, a consequence of exhaustion and grief layered too thick. I was wrong about that, too. The encounter didn't begin with a call. That's important. No dispatch tone, no logged incident. Just a stretch of patrol so quiet it felt curated, like the night had been cleared of distractions on purpose. I was driving west along a road I'd driven hundreds of times before. I knew every curve, every dip where headlights briefly lose the horizon. That familiarity is what made the first distortion noticeable. The road felt shorter, not visually, structurally. I passed a fence line that should have taken another 3 minutes to reach. I checked the speedometer. Normal. Engine steady. The radio clicked. Static. Then my own voice. Unit 12 en route. The transmission ended exactly the way mine usually did. Same cadence. Same slight hitch at the end where I released the mic too early. I hadn't touched the radio. I didn't respond. Rule number 2 held. The headlights caught Shiprock silhouette ahead, but the angle was wrong. It looked closer than it should have been, larger, pressing up against the sky. The land around it felt compressed, like depth had folded in on itself. I slowed to a stop, the moment the unit halted. Everything else did too. Wind died. Static cut. Even the engine's idle sounded muted, like it was wrapped in cloth. I stepped out of the vehicle. The ground felt uneven in a way I couldn't map. Not rocky, misaligned, as if pieces of the land had been shifted slightly out of place and set back down without regard for continuity. The road behind me looked longer than before. The road ahead looked closer. Distance was collapsing. I stayed still. That was one of the unspoken rules. When the land starts rearranging itself, movement is a negotiation. Stillness is neutral. My radio crackled again. Daniel. Not loud. Not close. Everywhere. I focused on my breathing and kept my gaze low, unfixed. Looking at things too directly had consequences. Peripheral awareness was safer. It let you notice without engaging. That's when I saw it. Not clearly, not fully. Just enough to know something was occupying space it shouldn't have been able to occupy. It wasn't tall or short in any consistent way. Its outline refused to settle. When I tried to register its shape, my eyes slid past it, like my vision didn't have permission to lock on. The wrongness of it wasn't visual. It was spatial. It stood where standing shouldn't have been possible, intersecting with the road and the air above it at the same time. The land reacted to it. The ground beneath my boots vibrated faintly, not like an earthquake, more like tension being held. The rock formations around us seemed to lean inward, subtle enough that I questioned whether they'd always done that. The radio looped. Unit 12 en route. Unit 12 en route. Unit 12. I powered it off. Silence rushed in, heavy and immediate. The thing shifted. Not toward me. Around me. Like it was testing angles. I remembered rule number 3. Never arrive early. Never stay late. Time matters here. I checked my watch. The second hand was moving, but the ticks felt uneven. I couldn't tell how long I'd been standing there. Minutes? Seconds? That uncertainty is dangerous. The land uses it to blur decision-making. I took one step backward. The road behind me shortened again, compressing like an accordion folding inward. The thing responded, not advancing, but aligning, matching my position without closing the distance. It wanted acknowledgement. That was the temptation. To name it, to define it, to confirm it existed in a way that made sense. But elders warned us about that too, without ever spelling it out. Some things don't need to be challenged. They need to be outlasted. So I didn't speak. I didn't move quickly. I didn't look directly at it. I let my eyes stay unfocused, aware without fixation. I listened for sound, knowing there wouldn't be any. Silence was part of the test. The land shifted again. The stars overhead dimmed, not fading but spacing themselves farther apart, as if the sky had stretched. The air felt thicker, harder to draw into my lungs. Panic hovered at the edges of my thoughts. But panic is loud. Loud draws attention. I focus on the rules instead. Rule number 1, trust the map, not the ground. Rule number 2, don't answer when called. Rule number 3, don't arrive early. Rule number 4, don't acknowledge what you can't hear. Rule number 5, don't follow what retreats. I stayed where I was. Minutes passed, or something like minutes. The radio powered itself back on with a soft click. Static hissed, then cleared. Dispatch voice. Normal. Grounded. Unit 12 status check. I waited a full breath before responding. Unit 12 on patrol. I said, nothing more. The thing reacted to that. Not angrily. Not violently. It recoiled, not physically, but geometrically. The space it occupied loosened, like a knot being untied one strand at a time. The land exhaled. Wind returned in a low rush. The road behind me lengthened to something recognizable. Shiprock silhouette settled back into its proper scale, distant and immovable. I didn't move until the stars snapped back into familiar positions. When I finally got back into the unit, my hands were steady in a way that scared me more than shaking would have. Adrenaline hadn't hit yet. I'd survived on something else. Focus, restraint, the refusal to engage. I drove away without checking my mirrors. The radio stayed quiet for the rest of the shift. No mimicry, no delays, as if the land had gotten what it wanted and retreated to watch again. But I knew better. That hadn't been an attack. It had been an assessment. And as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in harmless colors, I understood something that settled heavy in my chest. I hadn't escaped because I was stronger. I'd escaped because I followed rules that kept me uninteresting. Whatever I'd encountered didn't want to fight. It wanted attention. And I knew, with a certainty that made sleep impossible later that morning, that the next phase wouldn't be about survival in the moment. It would be about what happens after something decides it knows how close it can stand to you without being seen. After the encounter, I did what I'd always done. I went back to the station and wrote the report. That's the part people assume is hardest, putting words to something that doesn't want to be described. But the truth is, the report isn't where you tell the truth. It's where you decide which parts of it are allowed to exist. Time, location, unit status, weather conditions. Clean lines. Approved language. There are boxes for facts, not for wrongness. So I wrote that I'd experienced radio interference, that visibility had been limited, that the area presented navigational challenges. All of it technically accurate, none of it complete. The system accepted it without comment. My supervisor skimmed the report the next morning, nodded once, and signed off. No follow-up questions. No request for clarification. He didn't look at me when he did it. That was new. Before, he'd at least asked if I was okay. This time, he just closed the folder like it was something fragile. Institutional silence isn't an accident. It's a reflex. Out here, everyone knows there are things you don't elevate. You don't ask for task forces. You don't escalate anomalies unless you want outsiders stomping through places that don't tolerate attention. The fastest way to get yourself reassigned, or worse, discredited, is to insist something doesn't fit the framework everyone relies on. So the truth stays small, personal, contained. That's why these stories never become official. Because official means permanent. Permanent means examined. And examination requires language that doesn't exist yet. I tried talking to one of the older officers a few days later. Not directly. Just enough to test the edge of the conversation. I mentioned strange radio behavior. He listened without interrupting, then asked me one question. Did you follow the rules? I said yes. He nodded and changed the subject. That's how knowledge survives here. Passed sideways. Never written down. Never confirmed. You don't teach the rules. You recognize when someone else already knows them. Emotionally, I went numb after that. Not shut down, muted. Fear burns hot. Numbness preserves. I did my job. I took calls. I smiled when required. But everything felt distant, like I was watching my own life through a piece of glass that wouldn't quite come clean. Sleep didn't help. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see the thing from the road. I saw paperwork. Screens. Logs that didn't match memory. It's easier to process a shape than a system designed to erase it. What lingered wasn't terror. It was anticipation. I started noticing subtle changes in other officers. Nothing dramatic. A pause before responding to dispatch. A habit of double-checking printed maps that had gathered dust for years. Someone quietly removing a unit number sticker from their radio. Someone else refusing a call without being able to articulate why. The rules were spreading. Not formally. No meetings. No memos. Just behavior adjustments that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. That's how you know something is real. It changes how people act even when they don't talk about it. One night, dispatch logged a call that never aired. I saw it on the terminal before it disappeared. Location listed. Timestamp intact. No responding unit. No clearance code. Just gone. Another officer asked me later if I'd heard anything about it. I said no. We both knew that meant yes. There's a comfort in knowing you're not alone. There's also a danger. The more people follow the rules, the more noticeable the pattern becomes. And patterns attract attention. I began to wonder whether the rules were truly protective, or if they were simply teaching us how to behave in ways that kept us predictable, uninteresting, maybe, or manageable. That thought scared me more than the encounter itself, because if the rules were spreading, so was awareness. And awareness works both ways. I started adjusting my own habits again, changing patrol routes without logging the reason, delaying responses just long enough to avoid being early, listening for sound before trusting sight. Small things, quiet things. The land remained calm, watchful, like it was listening to a conversation it didn't need to participate in anymore. Every report I filed after that felt thinner, less connected to the reality of my nights. I wondered how many layers of a mission system could hold before it collapsed under the weight of what it refused to acknowledge. But collapse isn't how this place works. It adapts. By the end of that month, 3 officers had independently asked me about the same thing, movement without sound. They used different words, different examples, but the shape of the concern was identical. None of them wanted explanations. They wanted confirmation that ignoring it was the right choice. I told them what I'd been told. Follow the rules. Don't ask why. That's when it hit me. The rules weren't just being shared. They were being tested, refined, quietly adjusted as new situations forced them to evolve. What had kept me safe once might not be enough the next time. The land had made contact. The institution had chosen not to see it. And the space between those two truths was filling with people like me, tired, careful, carrying knowledge that didn't belong anywhere official. As I drove home one morning, the sky pale with first light, I realized something else that hadn't made it into any report. The rules weren't finished yet. They were still changing. And whatever we'd encountered out, there wasn't just watching individuals anymore. It was watching how we responded together. Once you accept that the rules aren't finished, you stop thinking of them as safeguards and start seeing them for what they really are, responses. The land doesn't follow a script. It reacts. It adjusts. And every time we learn how to move through it without being taken, it learns something about us in return. That's the part no one likes to say out loud. We aren't the only ones adapting. I started thinking back over old incidents. Calls that have been dismissed, disappearances explained away by exposure or poor judgment, reports that ended with phrases like unable to locate or no further information available. At the time, they'd felt isolated, unconnected, just the cost of working in a place where terrain itself can kill you. But patterns don't announce themselves until you know how to look. A search and rescue call from years before, where a hiker's footprints led in a perfect line to the edge of a wash and stopped. No sign of struggle, no indication they'd turned around. Just an ending where an ending didn't make sense. A rollover accident where the vehicle was found upright, engine still warm, doors open, and the driver's phone resting neatly on the seat, as if they stepped out briefly and forgotten to come back. A trainee who swore he'd seen lights moving along a ridge that wasn't accessible by any road, keeping pace with his unit before vanishing when he slowed down. At the time, we chalked those up to stress, fatigue, imagination. Now I wonder which rules hadn't existed yet when those things happened, which boundaries hadn't been discovered in time. The rules change because the land doesn't want to be understood all at once. It reveals itself incrementally through consequence. You don't get the full picture. You get just enough information to survive the last mistake. That realization shifted something in me. It wasn't about me anymore, or about Aaron, or even about officers working nights. It was about everyone who moved through this place assuming it would behave the way other places do. Outsiders are the most vulnerable, not because they're foolish, but because they're confident. They trust their maps, their timelines, their assumptions that nature is passive and less provoked. They don't feel the subtle resistance when a road shouldn't be driven, or the way the air changes when you're somewhere you aren't meant to linger. We get visitors all the time, hikers, photographers, contractors. People passing through see Shiprock as a landmark instead of a warning. Most of them are respectful. Some aren't. They wander off marked paths, ignore posted signs, laugh when locals tell them not to go somewhere after dark. I've seen what happens when those warnings are dismissed. Not dramatic, not immediate, just small deviations that add up. Missed turns, dead phones, a sense of being turned around that doesn't match the distance traveled. By the time they realize something's wrong, the rules they need to follow aren't available to them yet. That's the danger. The rules only protect you if you respect the place enough to learn them slowly. I started keeping a private notebook after that. Not dates or locations, patterns. Reactions. What changed after a rule was broken? What stayed consistent? I noticed that the land didn't repeat itself exactly. It varied, like it was avoiding predictability. The mimicry became subtler. Voices closer to right, but never perfect. Movements slower, less obvious. Distortions that could almost pass as natural if you weren't paying attention. It was learning restraint, and so were we. Officers stopped calling things, and that didn't need to be called in. We developed an unspoken understanding of when to clear a call early, when to take the long way around, when to let something sit unresolved because resolving it would make things worse. From the outside, it probably looked like laziness or negligence, but it was coordination, communal survival through omission. That's when the stakes shifted. If this were just about me, I could have transferred, requested daylight shifts, walked away. But it wasn't. It was about the district, about families who lived out here, about elders who knew the land well enough to avoid its moods without ever naming them. It was about containment, whether we admitted it or not. I started having conversations that felt dangerous in their quietness. A ranger mentioning that a trail had moved overnight. A dispatcher asking me, off the record, whether she should log a call that didn't feel right. A supervisor advising a new officer to trust his gut without explaining what that really meant. Knowledge was spreading laterally, not upward, and that's intentional. Once something becomes official, it invites scrutiny that doesn't understand context. Outsiders with checklists and equipment and confidence that they can solve a problem by observing it long enough. But this isn't a problem that tolerates observation. It tolerates distance, respect, limits. If you've ever been somewhere that felt wrong for reasons you couldn't articulate, some place where you instinctively lowered your voice or felt the urge to leave without knowing why, that instinct matters. It's older than logic. It's your body recognizing a boundary your mind hasn't caught up to yet. Ignore that instinct often enough, and the land notices. That's why the rules keep changing. Because the land keeps adjusting to how much attention it receives, how much curiosity presses against it, how often people try to reduce it to something manageable. I don't think it's malicious. Not in the way people want to imagine. It's defensive, territorial, responding to pressure the only way it knows how. By the time the next major incident happened, one that would force us all to reevaluate what we thought we understood, the rules had already shifted again, subtly, quietly, enough that following the old ones wouldn't be sufficient anymore. I felt it coming in the way the nights grew heavier, in the way calls clustered closer together, in the way the land no longer felt content with observation alone. The rules had kept us safe so far, but safety isn't the same as stability. And as I prepared for another stretch of nights, I couldn't shake the sense that whatever was watching us had finished learning how individuals behave. The next lesson would be about what happens when one of us stops following the rules, and the rest of us have to decide whether to intervene or let the land take its due. After enough nights like that, people start asking why you don't leave. Not directly, at first. It comes out sideways. Jokes about burnout. Comments about how long I've been on nights. Suggestions that I'd earned a transfer somewhere quieter, safer, closer to town. I nodded along when they said it, because on paper, it made sense. I had the seniority. I had the evaluations. No one would have questioned it. But leaving never felt like an option. Not really. Fear is what keeps you here. Fear is loud, dramatic. It spikes and fades. What keeps you here is responsibility. The slow, grinding kind that settles into your bones and refuses to move. This is my district. These are my roads. The people who live out here don't get to transfer away from the land when it changes its mind about them. Someone has to stay who knows when to hesitate. I thought about Aaron a lot during those months. About what it would mean to leave knowing he'd vanished under my watch. Leaving wouldn't undo that. It would just make it easier not to think about it. And I didn't trust Easy anymore. So I stayed. The cost showed up gradually. Sleep became optional. I learned how to rest without ever fully shutting down, the way prey animals do, half aware, listening even in dreams. I'd wake up convinced I'd heard my name, heart racing, only to realize the house was quiet and empty. Quiet didn't mean relief anymore. It meant I'd missed something. Hypervigilance crept into everything. I memorized the sound of my truck's engine, so I know if it ever changed. I noticed when streetlights flickered out of rhythm. I stopped wearing headphones. Even off duty, I kept track of where exits were, where shadows gathered, how long it took for sound to travel in open spaces. Loneliness came with that. You can't explain this kind of awareness to people who don't live with it. When I tried, conversation stalled. Concern turned into polite discomfort. Eventually, I stopped trying. It was easier to be alone than to feel misunderstood. There were nights I questioned whether staying was selfish, whether I was clinging to control instead of accepting limits. But then a call would come in, something small, something routine, and I'd recognize the warning signs before anyone else did. I'd slow a response, redirect a unit, clear something early, and nothing bad would happen. Those nights reinforced the choice. Survival, though, isn't the same as safety. That's another thing the land teaches you if you're patient enough to listen. Safety implies an end point, a stable state. Survival is ongoing, conditional, earned repeatedly. I accepted that I wasn't safe out here. Not truly, but I was informed, and information matters. There's a difference between being afraid and being cautious. Fear paralyzes. Caution adapts. I stopped resenting the rules for what they took from me and started respecting them for what they gave back. Time, mostly. More nights. More chances to intervene quietly before something went wrong. Still, the unease never left. It settled into the background of my life like a low hum. Easy to ignore until you stop moving. I learned not to stop moving. The community noticed, even if they didn't know why. Elders greeted me differently. Longer looks. Small nods. One of them told me, without context, that it was good I hadn't gone away. That some people were meant to stand in certain places longer than others. I didn't ask what he meant. As the seasons turned, the land remained watchful but restrained. No major incidents. No overt challenges. That was almost worse. Quiet could be a warning if it lasts too long. I found a kind of closure in that routine, not peace, but acceptance. This was the cost of staying. Fatigue, isolation, a constant awareness that safety was temporary and conditional. In return, the land allowed me to keep working, to keep intervening in small ways that never made reports. That balance felt fragile. I knew it wouldn't last forever, because all systems break eventually, and when they do, it's rarely dramatic at first. It starts with one person cutting a corner, one officer deciding the rules are superstition, one moment of impatience that feels justified. I sense that moment approaching the way you sense a storm before clouds appear, in the tension of the air, in the way calls began stacking closer together again, in the way silence started to feel crowded. Staying had cost me comfort, rest, and certainty. I'd paid willingly. But as I prepared for the next stretch of nights, I understood something else with quiet dread. The cost of staying was about to be recalculated, and whatever came next wouldn't be something I could manage alone.